session of Scribblers on the Move. To let you, first of all, to thank Sheldon and Sheila Lewis, who have hosted the earlier sessions and will be back next week. And a special thank you to Martin Green, who's been the technical support person throughout Scribblers. And remind people that we'll be on next week with, this was Toscanini, this by Lucy Antek Johnson, and short stories by Yermahiu Aaron Taub. So we should have a great final session. Reminding everybody that we're going, if you haven't, that we're going to try to mute all to let the speaker speak, and put your questions in the chat, and we're going to answer all questions at the end. So let me just check.
That's optimistic.
I don't see Roger yet, but maybe I'm missing him here. Well, we do want to be cognizant of people's time, so we're gonna start. And we got two Anja Hesed authors tonight, not outside authors. We have Owen Lewis, who's our only poet this year, and Owen has read at Scribblers before, but his new book, Field Light, which he was supposed to have read from, I think, 2 years ago, is really a remarkable achievement. It's, I think, remarkably ambitious. It's poetry of prose, and social history, history of medicine, many fields are covered in this really remarkable book.
Josh, I'm going to mute everybody.
So people, please mute themselves so we can hear.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So we're going to start. We're going to start. Talk louder. We're going to start with Owen tonight, and I believe Martin's going to enable him to share screen because Owen wants to show the cover of his book because it's very important in terms of what the book is about. So, Martin, can you do that?
Sure, I've already done it.
Great.
Okay, good evening, everyone. And Josh, thank you. And Sheldon and Sheila, thank you so much. For those who have been to readings on the roof of Anshe Hesed, I really miss that place, but this is quite wonderful to have the opportunity to read tonight. And I'm going to put up the cover of the book. Here we go.
You may see us now like this.
Yes. Can you see this?
Yes.
Now, the book, as Josh says, is a really a social, cultural, artistic history of the Berkshires, but a very personal history. Pieces made up, a lot taken from received history. It's extensively footnoted, and really asks the question, and I think in this way pairs very nicely with Roger's book, how do you come to belong to a place? And one of the answers is not only knowing the history, but making the history yours. And this book is entwining of a personal story and history. Now, I would say I had a head start on that in that the house my wife Susan and I inhabit here is a historic house. And the picture on the cover that you can see here is the back porch doesn't quite look like that today. This is a photograph from 1922 of the former owners of the house. And who are they? And they become very important. The house belongs to Peggy Cresson, who was the daughter of Daniel Chester French. Her parents' house is just down the street, and his studio down the street, where he sculpted most famously the Lincoln Memorial, also the Minutemen, DuPont Circle, the alma mater at Columbia. She was a sculptress in her own right. Now, I have a number of archival photos of the house, and sitting on the book really begins with a meditation on this photograph. Who were these people? What were they thinking? And where would I have been in relation, in 1922? One can't help but think, where would I as a Jew be in 1922 in relation to these people who in their own way were very liberal-minded? Next to her is Hilda Beecher Stowe, the granddaughter-in-law of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her sister, Gertrude Robinson Smith, who also lived down the road and was one of the founders of Tanglewood, and her husband, Peggy Cresson, and the photographer is attributed to a Dr. Lambert, a physician, a country physician. So sitting on this very back porch and looking at this photograph is in many ways where the book begins. Okay. So the story is meant to be a continuous story. Much of it is in poetry. There are many sections in prose that kind of freely goes in and out of prose. There's a central section, which I'm not going to read from, actually two sections written in a dramatic format. There's a very important mental institution right in the middle of Stockbridge, and the Austin Riggs Institute, and there's a rather crazy scene where everybody, including an impersonator of Peggy Cresson, get in on the act. Austin Riggs comes back, and even W.B. Du Bois makes an appearance. So I'm going to begin reading. The titles are as much stage directions because it moves in time between current time and historic time. It begins 2018, Glendale Crossing, and I'm imagining here a train's going by, but there were many historic train lines which are referenced here, which of course don't exist today, but one could easily imagine them. 2018, Glendale Crossing. Dusk, a freight train crossing the road out of the dusk back into dust. Once out of the east and into the west, a long delay. In Worcester, it won't reach Pittsfield until long after dark and won't take him where he needs to go. A lone driver stopped in his auto, a flickering of metal and the low sun behind him spotlights the lines car by car. Providence, Worcester, Boston, Albany, New York Central, Providence. Against the deepening sky, he sees the horizon hauled by the train. its pulsing click-clack, rusty wheels, the strained axles singing of tonnage. The train men know this crossing, its lights and switches, the couplings and uncouplings, maze of tracks, maze of mistakes, stalled, the flashing arm. Before him, he's held up by the train and held in place. This place, how long he doesn't know. Before him, it's signaling bells, endless bells, not chimes, not carillons, bells. Still waiting at the crossing. In the bells, a black bell sound, a shovel packing soil, hitting stone, and light falls like gauze once wedding veil. White churches and pointed steeples of thudding bells. The sky drapes too deep, its blue, its unexpected cloth, striping of flag and memory of anthem. My darker light drops into the Berkshire air, if painted by whose hand, if sung, what voice sustained, a soft breeze hiding in the air, shadows arms across my arm, asking what, whispering what. The next poem, the not exactly title, but the placing of it, 1991, State Office of Mental Health downsizes asylums, inmates wander off. And, you know, when I was writing this book, I was remembering in a way this historically is why, in fact, I bought the house in the Berkshires. And it was very reminiscent of much that we were experiencing last summer when, you know, there were a lot of homeless people, a lot of deinstitutionalized people on the street. And in 1991, the state asylums were really opened up. And that's some of the backstory. In my New York office, phones constant ringing, and my then wife's panic call, an insane playground stampede, mothers crashing strollers, stuffed bears, shoes, dollies flying, the sandbox, where the kids play. A man shits and grunts, then paws at it like a cat. Who are these people? I confess, I signed the physician's petition, lobbied Albany for a plan to free the state patients with a new Bill of Rights, an emancipation proclamation, old guard docs surrender. I tried to do right, trying to keep everyone happy, keeping instead everyone's unhappiness, making me feel criminal. He rose up right out of the sand, lost a blanket, nearly lost the kids. Enough of this melting pot. We need to get away, get away. You need to do something, do something. You've got to do something. In the section a bit later, porch photo, the dormouse. And here's where I'm introducing the picture you saw previously. And by the way, I refer in certain sections to myself as Dr. Lewis. It is both me, but very much a fictionalized account that sort of aims more at what's emotionally true rather than factually true. Dog days of August, the back porch lulls, hours napped drifting. Dr. Lewis spends the month alone, a sort of sabbatical. He should be used to this unfamilied state by now, but he's not. No visitors, not one. His only companion, an old photograph. He studies it just beside his wicker easy chair, a photograph of a prior owner with her guests, picture acquired years ago for a touch of local history, now warped by the outdoor humidity. They posed for the photo as a familiar group on that same back porch, a late summer day, 1922. They sit around a rough farm table. Peggy Cresson, daughter of Daniel Chester French, sculptor of public monuments. They called it Il Terrazzo, so named for her wedding last year in Taormina. Her visitors, Mrs. Hilda Beecher Stowe, granddaughter-in-law of the late Harriet Beecher Stowe, and her sister, Miss Gertrude Robinson Smith. And at the end of the small table, William Penn Cresson, much older husband of Peggy. The photo attributed to Dr. Walter Lambert. He too remains outside of the photo as he retired. They have been here all along on this porch, in this house, originally 2 rooms up, 2 rooms down. Once a tenant farmers whose sons found work in Housatonic paper mill a mile away. Across and down the road, a 5-minute walk, her parents' summer cottage, 20 rooms. This small house renovated for the couple as a wedding gift by a doting father. Father and daughter plan together, and from one letter to the next, the dormer house becomes the dormouse. He studies the photo a moment, century old, in the very place he now sits, a town full of history, and he's not part of it, not even part of his own history. He tries to squeeze into that summer of 1922. And still looking at the photograph, this designated photo as Rorschach. This New York Jew sits just outside their picture. Could a Jew fit in here? Much easier to be a Jew in New York. As the Anglicans sip their iced and minted sweet tea, 1922, already 5 congregations have formed just 10 miles north in Pittsfield. 1861, Anshe Amunim, Men of Faith on Fenn Street, and the first shofar blows over Berkshire County. The war between the states, 6 months into its battles with its own trumpeting. In 1867, also in Pittsfield, Russian immigrants formed their own congregation, Am Echad, one people, but the Russians congregate among themselves, as do the Germans, as do the Sephardic before them. And in the year of the shared iced tea, Jewish farmers 8 miles south in Great Barrington formed their own congregation, Ahavat Shalom, Lovers of Peace, Great Barrington, where Du Bois was born 1868, attending the Clinton African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and preachers often praise the shofar's call of Mr. and Mrs. Cresson, Mrs. Beecher Stowe, Miss Smith, Dr. Lampert, lovers of peace and all humanity, they believe. Now a Jew sits just outside their midst. Hello, hello. Blast a shofar to get their attention to Kiyah, hello. Dr. Lampert would never have acknowledged him then. A turn of fate, flip of the calendar years. What of the great Maimonides and other physicians of Sephardic Spain? And this present day, Lewis had so easily pursued medicine. but he would not have been Dr. Lampert's colleague in 1922. Resting on his chest, rising and falling on his nap's inspiration, respiration, passing through, another Jew passing through beyond eyeshot of the photo, Stanley Kunitz, as if Kunitz this moment sat companionably with him on break from his work as a Worcester Gazette journalist interviewing the artist protesters at the home of the presiding trial judge, the U.S. versus Sacco and Vanzetti. As if Kunitz were a grandfather he never knew, born and raised not far away in Worcester, and in the same 1922, he begins his studies at Harvard. Kunitz is later denied pursuit of a Harvard PhD by Professor John Livingston Lowe's English department chair, Coleridge scholar, who tells him the Anglo-Saxon students would resent being taught by a Jew. And he, by the way, is the only poet in America to have twice been the US Poet Laureate. I'm going to skip to a parallel story because I think, you know, what happens to Kunitz isn't, of course, Du Bois is a little bit earlier, but Du Bois was born in Great Barrington. And Harvard treated him actually much better. We'll get to that. More history dumped right in front of me. Here, it's everywhere, can't be avoided. Good to poke around. I slow. W.E.B. Du Bois' boyhood home site, a swerve off Route 23, empty parking lot. Why have I never visited? This site where a family lived just outside town. How far do town lines reach? Where does outside begin or end? The site itself seems lonely, a loud sign just beyond. Respect your neighbor, don't veer off path. Anger lingers, but through the fragrant pines, the cedar's dusk, a boulder, a bench, a marker, no house or hut at the edge of cornfield quiet. Just after the Civil War, a town far north of the line of separation, safely a century into land-owning freedom. Black and white children play recess tag together, color line quiet enough, but one child, slight, just one, the veil appears out of nowhere. It is everywhere, the invisible divider. Cornfields beyond the pines rattle in winter. Town churches sent him to Fisk, to Nashville's first loud lessons of Jim Crow, the house behind the curtain of pines dimming. And finally, quote, at Harvard, not of it, 1895, first doctorate to a person of color, where he's made to repeat his entire course of undergraduate studies. Who would have taught him at Fisk, and where did they study? He returned to Great Barrington to bury a wife, later a son. Where does he belong? Drawn to the house, it's gifted to him, but never moves back. A lonely childhood, and he dies in Ghana. Next day, King proclaims the dream. It is 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial. the proclamation a century old. In 1922, at the memorial's dedication, Du Bois can't forget colored, seated apart, sees the 19-foot statue looming, sees a temple of compromise honoring the Union, not emancipation. Can't forget the letter sent to him from a Clark history class. What teacher allowed it? Quote, "Will you please tell us whether or not it is true that Negroes are not able to cry? Is it true?" And that letter was actually sent to him. Okay, you know, there are lots of themes in this book, but I want to stay with this for a bit, and there's another, I think, important piece of history here. Now, along the way, I invent a character called Adam, who is the caretaker, in a fictional caretaker of the property where I live. His name is Adam. He is said to be part Native American, part African American, and descended from the family Adams. And he is a real voice of wisdom throughout the book. I always say, cover the weeping bruise, apply ointment and a bandage. Adam says, show the bruise to air and sun and rain. Air's the best salve. Adam says, show the wound, let it tell. Words in the air bring light. Words in the air bring freedom to bruise and wound, to break and burn. Eyes burn red and breath gasp the mangle of injury. If wind can carry word, which wounds to cover, which exposed? The wound became the hero. Long ago, his Auntie Mumbit, a step great-great-grandmother of Du Bois, born into slavery 1744 in Claverack, New York, Peter Hogenboom's farm, at age 7, given to his daughter Hannah on her marriage to John Ashton, and was moved to Sheffield, Massachusetts. She married, had a child, little Bet. Her husband did not return from the Revolutionary War. Vile-tempered, Mistress Hannah one day aimed to strike little Bet with a hot shovel. Mumbit interposed, took the shovel blow to her arm. All winter the wound festered and oozed, and she refused to cover it up. Asked what had happened, she replied, ask the missus. She heard the newly ratified state constitution read in public in the Sheffield Commons, and insisted, I ain't no dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom? And she found her way to a young lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, in nearby Stockbridge. With another slave of the Ashleys, Sedgwick argued her case for freedom. Brom and Bet versus Ashley, heard before the County Court of Common Pleas in Great Barrington, August 1781. The jury ruled in Bet's favor, and after, slavery banned in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I'll conclude. I mean, the book, among other things, looks at the Lincoln Memorial, looks at the Lincoln, that the statue of, well, maybe I'll finish with that poem. But there's a meditation earlier of W.B. Daniel Chester French meditating on the statue. And so that workshop is just down the road from me. You can see a maquette, you know, a life-size maquette of the statue. But then from there, of course, it was made into the 19-foot statue. And this section, it's called the National Mall, Washington, D.C. And I'll conclude with this poem. On the mall in front of the monument where Daniel Chester French's Lincoln sits, 1922, Memorial Day, dedication of the monument, 50,000. 1925, Ku Klux Klan, 40,000. 1939, Marian Anderson, barred by the DAR from the National Cathedral, 50,000 and a nationwide broadcast. 1959, MLK, give us the ballot, 25,000. 1963, MLK, I have a dream, 250,000. 1969, national mobilization, end the war in Vietnam, 600,000. 1989, March for Women's Rights, 500,000. 1993, LGB Rights and Liberty, 800,000. 1995, Million Man March. 2004, March for Women's Lives, 1,100,000. 2017, Women's March Against Trump, 1,500,000. And to think that this monument has witnessed all of this protest, all of this clamoring for freedom, and still, you know, a symbol of, I think, what is best in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. That was great. Actually, your last poem was a marvelous segue to Roger's book, in a way, because Roger's book, Reborn in the USA, is really the story of a young man in England who grows up never sort of feeling like he's at home in England and always attracted to the United States. And it moves from those early years in England and ends actually at the time of the election of Joe Biden, and people pouring into the streets, and that feeling of the United States still being a beacon of hope despite all the issues. Roger is the host of Men in Blazers, a superb soccer commentator, and one of the funniest human beings you'll ever hear. So anybody who knows anything about introductions always knows you should limit your remarks when your following speaker is both funnier than you and has an English accent. So let's hear from Roger Bennett tonight. I'm really excited about this. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's lovely to be with everybody at Anshe Chesed. I just want to thank the community for being such an incredible home for my family. I've had two kids bar mitzvahed in that sanctuary, and hopefully a couple more to come. I think the whole community is amazing. Rabbi Kalmanowski, the single greatest. We share a great love of the Bears and a great love of all things Midwest. My book is a love letter to the United States of America. I wrote it during COVID, during lockdown in Manhattan. I think we all remember it. I don't need to rekindle that darkness of the first few months, that March, that April, that May, where just it felt like we were plunged into the unknown, just the darkness, fear, chaos, such unreal uncertainty. And I think it's a standard human emotion in times of panic in the present to revert to the past, to happier memories, tap into happier memories of the past. And what I did, with really without thinking, We live on 99th Street. We always joke that Anshe Chesed is Hebrew for half a block away. So we're in the apartment in New York City. And I just started, I cover sports, and sports stopped completely. The world of sports ground to a halt. It's the narrative around which I build my life, structure my life, find meaning, global connectivity, make memories. And so I just, without thinking about it, almost entered a fever dream. And rather than stay in the present, which was dark, I moved back into the past, the happy moments in my life. As you can tell, I am an American. I became an American in 2018, one of the greatest days of my life, to raise my hand, say the oath of allegiance, with 162 individuals from all over the world, many of whom had escaped famine, civil war, crisis, walked across deserts to be in America, all of us drawing strength from the American idea, which has really informed my life. I grew up in Liverpool, England in the 1980s. It's a magnificent city, but in the 1980s, it was a really dark time economically. The coal pits had shut down, the steel mills. Liverpool was the port city that used to bring all of that out to the world. It really lost its meaning, huge unemployment, a heroin epidemic. Life was bleak. If you've seen the movie Billy Elliot, you kind of get the drift of what life was like in England. And I couldn't ballet dance, but what I did have was American culture. I really feasted upon the movies, the books, the television shows, the movies, the NFL teams, the music, all of which loomed larger than life and showed me a world that felt like it was lived in color with hope and joy and courage, whereas my life was lived in black and white. And so I told myself that I was an American trapped in an Englishman's body, which was actually quite true in a way, because my great grandfather, as in the piece I will read, he was headed, as you'll find out, for Chicago, hence the Bears adoration. And I say this weekend, I went with my oldest son, Samson, to Chicago. Eventually, the book tells about my love of America, my dream of moving here, making it here and fulfilling that dream. If you can just mute your beautiful Zooms, Anshe Chesed members, so we don't hear you cooking your dinner, which sounds amazing and makes me incredibly hungry. Just mute your Zooms. Thank you. So I went to Chicago with my oldest son, Samson, who's about to start his own life journey as I started mine. And I threw out the first pitch at the Chicago White Sox. And I was just reminded of the conveyor belt of life. So I'm going to read you from first chapter of my book. Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to read the first chapter of my book, which tells of this is my great grandfather, just so you can have a visual aid. It's very handsome. That's my great grandfather, Harris, who I refer to. That's in the Russian army uniform that he served. And this is my grandfather, Sam, who was his son in Liverpool, who Samson's named after. Here we go. We're going in. One of the earliest beliefs that I still cling to in life is I was born an American trapped in an Englishman's body. That's a kind of story you manufacture about yourself when you grow up in a place like Liverpool in the 1980s. Back then, the city was apocalyptic, a rotting, dilapidated carcass in grim decline. When I first watched Mad Max, I thought the wasteland Mel Gibson braved appeared like an upgrade in comparison. And when you live somewhere like Liverpool, you ask yourself a simple yet powerful question on an almost daily basis. How on earth did I land here? There are fewer than 3,000 Jews in Liverpool, a gaggle of doctors, accountants, and lawyers, with the occasional dentist thrown into the mix for variety. Every family has the same variation of an explanation to the above question. The tale generally begins with a great-grandparent fleeing whatever inhospitable, frigid, rotting, potato-stenched Eastern European shtetl that they try to pass off as home, hot-footing it onto the steerage level of an ocean liner, chased right up to the gangplank in almost every telling by a rabid band of Cossacks with murder on their mind. And when that vessel stopped briefly to refuel along the way, their ancestors had been among the simpler-minded, dimmer ones who glimpsed the one tall building on the Liverpool skyline and believed they were staring right at New York City, their intended destination. Fatally mistaken, they disembarked and were left to eke out pennies in the English Northwest, rather than undoubtedly make their fortunes in that promised land filled with bounty and possibility, the United States of America. The myth was certainly true for my family. My great-grandfather was a kosher butcher from Berdichev, a textile town in northern Ukraine. His escape plan was rational: to flee to Chicago, Illinois, a city that made sense for a meat man, as it was the self-professed hog capital of the world. Liverpool, not so much. A paucity of clients made it hard to earn a living as a kosher meat wholesaler. Improvisation was necessary, which ultimately meant servicing the need for halal beef among the growing Muslim population, scattered across the gloomy, declining mill towns of the north of England. It was amidst this sodden wasteland of a city, with its mouldy terraced housing, drab chip shops, and cheap booze houses, that a handful of Jews had accidentally marooned themselves, a land with a low-grade fear hanging over it, a place as dispiriting as the sunless sky and the all-pervasive dampness you couldn't shake, no matter how many layers of clothing you put on. Certainly the most infertile ground to sow escape-fueled romantic dreams of freedom, acceptance, and success. The Jews stayed put because they were exhausted and relieved, and after escaping the Russian bloodlands, they had pretty low standards. Any place offering more than immediate death and destruction was an upgrade. And because adaptation is in the DNA of the Jewish people, they always attempt to make sense of the world around them. I often wondered what early encounters between these bewildered Yiddish speakers and local Liverpudlians must have been like. One group with their spigot of broken Yiddish-inflected English sounding like a constant moaning complaint. The other snorting Scouse words angrily out of their nasal passages. A local dialect so baffling, it's as if the sentences have somehow been recorded and then replayed backwards. One way or another, the new arrivals worked out how to raise their synagogues, open their delis, break ground on their cemeteries, striking out to pursue the best Britain could offer its accidental citizens, the security of grinding their way to middle-class comfort. I'm going to read one more little piece, jump ahead a little bit, because it's about my grandfather. And I'll just say one of the joys of releasing a book is to bring people who've passed away back to life. There's a couple of people who've really shaped my life, and to be able to talk about them regularly in the media, when you're on NPR, they always love to bring up the characters in the book, to bring their memories back to life has been one of the joys of my 2020, 2021 lockdown experience. It's about my grandfather, who was my best mate. My grandfather continued the family meat line, but grudgingly. I learned not to blame him after accepting an invitation to experience his job for a day. At the abattoir, where he plied his trade, I watched him wander into a pen of defeated cattle and insert his fist into one unfortunate cow's anus after another. My grandfather's arm would thrust deep into the animal, disappearing right up to the armpit, a feat that somehow empowered him to assess the ultimate quality of the meat. With a grimace, he'd slowly retrieve his limb and murmur, "Good anus," or sometimes, "Bad cow that," to a silent, melancholy note-taking assistant before moving on to the next. My grandfather was an intellectually curious, quiet, dapper man, and the whole ordeal seemed to make him suffer more than it did the cows. At home with slippers on, reclining on a throne like mahogany and leather couch in his living room, my grandfather was altogether more content. We'd play game after game of chess, evenly matched. The two of us were a great pair. I was hungry for company, he was eager to talk about the things that really interested him. With a pot of tea, an endless supply of chocolate-covered digestives, we'd engage in serious man talk about the important things in life: war movies, history books, and Everton Football Club. But by far his favorite topic of conversation was the United States of America, or rather, recounting random memories born of his frequent pilgrimages to the American shores. This was the destination my grandfather had repeatedly traveled to for vacation since the 1950s, an intrepid decision back in an era when British vacationers rarely ventured far from home. These adventures started way before transatlantic flight was a regular facet of life, alongside the couch on a small matching side table on which he placed his most vital lounging items: a packet of senior service cigarettes, a family-sized slab of fruit and nut chocolate, and a brick-sized primitive television remote control was a black and white photograph of him bound for New York City, standing proudly beside a plucky propeller plane, refueling in some remote snow-filled airfield in Goose Bay, Labrador, or Gander, Newfoundland. The instant the topic turned to America, the chess game was forgotten. My grandfather would sit back, cigarette in hand, and the tales flowed as if he'd entered a fever dream. Fragments of memory from journeys to Florida, New York, California would tumble out of his mouth. Did you know, in Vegas, they serve you breakfast while you play the slot machines? He'd say, with an undiminished sense of astonishment. Or in Times Square, there are diners where they refill your coffee cups the second you finish them. Or Miami is a land filled with Jews, and the restaurants grill steaks that are bigger than the plate that carries them. When things were really dark, he'd wander over to the fireplace, retrieve a cheap plastic tchotchke Statue of Liberty that he'd returned with from one of his many trips, and he'd shake his head sadly as he looked at it, and he'd say, "Roger, we should have lived there. We should have lived there." I think that's enough reading. But that is the origin of my love for America. It's the idea around which I built my life. I think it's very normal for adolescents to dream about other places, to think about another. One of the funniest things about doing this book is that I've had thousands of Americans tell me, "Oh my God, you wanted to live in Chicago. When I was in LA growing up, I dreamt of living in Manchester because of the music I loved." And I'm always like, "Oh man, you dodged a bullet." But the reality is, I think it's very common for young individuals, adolescents, and many of you have had them, you've all been them, to dream about being in a different place where life is funnier, warmer, you're cooler, people laugh at your jokes, you're the person you want to be but can't be. And the one thing I guess that makes me different is I acted upon it. I had the Statue of Liberty and the Manhattan skyline painted on my bedroom wall when I was a kid. I now live in New York. I made that dream come true. It's the story of a lifetime. And to finish off this piece that I read, my grandfather over his couch had photos. Many of you will be able to picture this. He had hundreds of photographs of relatives from Russia and Ukraine. And when I was bored, I'd always point at one, this thick-necked guy, this crazy thick-necked, murderous looking guy. And I'd be like, "Grandpa, who's that guy?" And he'd always be like, "Oh, that's your great grandpa." And I'd be like, "What's his name?" And he'd say, "We can't remember, but he's the Cossack killer. He's the one when the Cossacks came for us. He killed them. He's the Cossack killer." And my dream in life is that in 6 or 7 generations' time, my descendants will have my headshot from television over their dining room table. And when they're all got their family together, someone will point at it and my big bald head and say, "Who's that guy?" And they'll obviously say it in an American accent, which I still can't do. They'll say, "Who's that guy?" And with mouths full, my descendants will look at each other and they'll say, "We can't remember his name, but he's the one. He's the one that brought the family to the United States of America. It's an honor to be here, honor to be with you. It's a joy of my lifetime to be in the United States of America, which is why I wrote this love letter. And I'm incredibly grateful. I'm going to hand you back to the great Josh Hampett.
He's so fun.
Thank you, Roger. That was terrific. Owen and Roger, really, really wonderful to hear both of you. Really, all about America, both of them in different ways. You know, Roger, I think about my time, I spent 1976 in England. And, you know, I was this bookish American kid. I said, I want to go to the land of English literature. And I ended up in the only college south of the Thames in London, Goldsmiths College. It's a working class college. It was not like a tremendous intellectual experience. It was in New Cross Gate, which wasn't Liverpool in 1976, but not that much better. And I was thinking, this is not what I expected. But I went to the English dormitory, and the kids in the dormitory all wanted to watch American TV police shows and drink Budweiser. So, you know, it's like, it's always what you don't know that you want. But I love the book. Owen, your book is really remarkable how you weave so many things into a meditation on history and fate and life. It's really, it's a remarkable sort of development of your past books. You really reached deeper and wider than I've seen you do before. We have some questions from the audience that I'll ask. Somebody asked you, Roger, what kind of Jewish upbringing did you have in Liverpool? Synagogue, or religious education, etc.
My grandpa Harris came to Liverpool. There was no synagogue, and he actually built the first synagogue, Chilwell Shul. And my grandfather Sam was a very observant gentleman. You've got to remember, in England, largely there's really just orthodoxy. We're almost like Mizrahi Jews in Israel. We kind of like see no discordance between going to shul on a Saturday, which everybody did, and going to the football match in the afternoon. Like there wasn't the same reform or conservative presence. So I went to the shul that my grandfather built, and I thought the Jewish community was enormous. I've got to say that in Liverpool there were 3,000 Jews, and I just thought it was immensely massive. We had a tennis club, mostly because no non-Jews would let us play at theirs. We had a golf club, the same, because no one would let us play there. There was incredible communal infrastructure from the cradle to the grave, and everybody knew everybody. It was so, my wife, when she comes over from New York, she can't believe how everybody knows absolutely everybody, and it's incredible. It's a beautiful and wonderful place to grow up. But the first time I met an American, I was about to go to Leeds University, which was the Jewish university. They had 300 Jewish kids out of 25,000 student body. And the American I was with was just laughing. He was like, oh my God, that would be like the single least Jewish university. He's like, that would be like Texas Christian University probably has more Jews. So, I mean, there's a big storyline to the book. Obviously, being Jewish, I never really properly felt English. And that was also one of the great drivers to come to the United States. But the Liverpool Jewish community, if you're ever there, I can hook you up for Shabbos, anybody who's on this Zoom.
Okay. Marla Cohen says that he had a parallel upbringing in Liverpool to you, that his father was next to yours in Childwall Shul.
It's Avram Kaplan. Yeah. Using your wife's account.
He said he thinks in his experience, American Jews have no concept of the Jewish room in Liverpool College. Perhaps you can comment.
Hold on one second. This is the person who sat next to my dad at Chilwell Shul.
Yeah, it's Avram Kaplan. My father, Mick Kaplan, sat next.
Oh my God, Mick Kaplan.
Yeah.
Oh, that is old school. Oh my God.
I remember my father arguing with your grandfather about a quarter penny a pound of beef because they were both kosher wholesalers.
Yeah, your grandfather. I've got to have words about Mick. Mick did hard deals. Mick Kaplan was my grandpa Sam's mate and nemesis. That was like,
That's right, correct.
Oh,
They were the best frenemies.
they all but they loved each other and they all hated each other.
That's right.
My grandfather Sam, it's in the book. My grandfather had 11 brothers, and just they all in those days, Jewish Liverpudlians, they'd all fall out over everything. And there's just Bruegel. Don't speak to that one. I've got a Bruegel with him. I don't speak to that one. And I used to, as I got older, I'd go to each of these brothers died. And my grandfather hadn't spoken to many of them in years. And I went to the funeral of his last one, brother Charlie, in Southport. And he was crying during the funeral, as you would. And then he got in the car and he was crying on the way back. And I was like, why are you crying, Grandpa? You didn't speak to him for 20, 30. I was just a kid. I didn't know about trauma and agony. I said, why are you crying? You didn't speak to him for 30 years. He goes, yeah. I said, Grandpa, did you wish you'd spoken to him? Is that what it is? And he said, no. He said, you should always hate. But he said, make sure you hate with a reason. And then he drove the car a bit further, and then he looked at me and he goes, and make sure you write that reason down. He could never remember any of he knew who he'd fallen out with, but he could never remember any of the reasons. Can I just tell you, your father was a great man, really a Liverpool legend, and it's really made my night to honor his memory and to be able to talk about him with the Anshe Chesed membership. It's beautiful.
So they both went to join the army in the Second World War at the same time. And my father was 4F and rejected. And your father went to North Africa your grandfather went to North Africa as a desert rat. And he said, if I die, I'm coming back to haunt you.
There you go. I just found actually all of his letters, which he sent to my grandma once a week. And all of it was just, like, this guy is in a siege. Rommel is down upon him. Just it's dark as heck. Like, they were really suffering. And all of his letters were just like, don't do business with Mick. Mick's ripping you off. Make sure you don't tell the tax man about this one. We don't talk about that account. We don't tell the tax. And it's just like, those guys, they were grinders.
So I also remember going to the abattoir and my mother saying, Mick, don't let him get any blood on him.
That's how we grew up. Can I just say, we should after this, if you can work out through the great Josh how we can connect, we are going to dominate this entire Zoom, and
I'd love to do that.
I'm cognizant of time, but it's very lovely to be with you and to honor your father's memory.
Okay. Unmute myself. I have a question for Owen here from someone who wants to know. Let me move that up in the chat to see how you wove in research into poetry. How was that process for you? Because your book is obviously very seriously researched, but it's a book of poetry.
Well, I don't follow a historic method, and it was more sort of personal research. One is just paying attention to what's around you and then asking a few more questions, doing a little bit of reading, or looking at street names and wondering how they got their names. And it's sort of paying attention to the history that's there. You know, if you pay attention to it, like, sure, I knew Du Bois, but why did it take me 20 plus years to swerve off the road and go take a look at his boyhood home site? And so imagining, you know, I think imagination also has a lot to do with history, because you're given so much, or there are a lot of facts, but it's only through the imagination that you make it live for yourself. And that's where you infuse yourself into it. And I wasn't worried, frankly, about writing history per se. I was more interested in my own curiosity. And if that curiosity led to distorted versions of that history, I didn't care. But I footnoted what I could to make clear what was my elaborations and what was in fact or as we know fact, which is probably somebody else's imaginations of what had happened. Yeah.
All right. Oh, by the way, Roger, I might as well tell you since I see it right here. The email address for your friend here is avramc@gmail.com.
Amazing.
So
Great
now
work. Everyone on the Zoom, email him right now.
Scribblers makes amazing connections between people. Who thought I would have two Liverpool Jews connect over Scribblers on the Roof? But you never know, you know. Someone asked, can you each talk in a different way about the evolution of your projects? You know, how did you develop your work? How did Owen, how did this work grow out of your past volumes of poetry? Roger, how did you come to like write this love letter to America, following up on your Men in Blazers experience?
Roger, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I'll be very succinct because I'm very cognizant of time. I mean, I tried to address that at the beginning of just the fear of at the beginning of the pandemic, this retreating into the past. That's really how I attacked it. And it was really a fever dream that I love my work. I'm a man who has been very lucky to find a passion and turn it into an occupation. And when sports shut down and I lost all structure, and not just structure, but a sense of connectivity that global sports brings, meaning and memory, I just naturally plunged into this project. And it was, you know, I make a lot of documentary films, so I structured it like a documentary film with plot points. And then for 4.5 months, really just, I mean, my family laughed when they'd say what it was like. It was like living with a maniac. And I did, when my book came out and did what it did, which was when it hit the New York Times bestseller list, I published a photograph of myself wandering out of the house for the first time in 4.5 months. I'd really just stayed in the house for 4.5 months typing, like in those old movies you see where the secretary's like ding. I was just working, it just locked it all down, and I walked out into the sunlight for the first time with like a Tom Hanks castaway beard and really translucent white arms. I looked bloody awful. And the one thing that was hard for me was that America kept changing after I'd finished the first draft. It wasn't just COVID, it was the Black Lives Matter summer and the agony and the trauma of that going right into the 2020 election. So to write a love letter to America, as America itself is evolving dramatically, was very difficult. And I wrote and rewrote. I mean, the epilogue is the piece that I am most proud of, which really deals with the moment when I became American. And what that felt like for me and my family, and that had to constantly rewrite through the back end of 2020 as America itself kind of ricocheted around through the end of the election results.
For me, the genesis of the book, I think twofold. One, I mentioned just looking at this archival photograph and how odd it was to sit in the very same place that people sat 100 years ago and have some knowledge of them and begin to think how, well, we're both enjoying this porch. We both enjoyed company on this porch, but who were they entertaining? So that was one line. The first poem, not a poem that I read tonight, the caretaker suddenly appears. I had no idea who this caretaker was, but then I got curious, and it was like he announced himself in a very tangential way, and I started following the leads of that. And, you know, the book, you know, at first it was a sequence of poems, then it was a short book, and it almost opened like an accordion from the inside out, rather than, having a fixed sequence. And I sort of discovered the story as I was writing it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll mute myself. I want to remind everyone, by the way, in the flyer that went out about Scribblers on the Roof, they have links into how you can purchase both of these books. Authors like to sell books, not just talk about them, and we want you all to buy these. Roger, the one thing I have to say that your book is funny and sad at times, and the thing that sort of hit me in a real nice way was the teacher who sort of, when you were hanging out with the cool kids and screwing up in school, came to you and said, like, it's time you do better, and really gave you the rough side of his really took you off short. And I mean, those are the amazing moments that people have in their lives when somebody comes in and reaches out and really changes you. And I thought that was incredibly moving.
Thank you. His name was Mr. McNally. He was a giant of a man. And I went to a private school in Liverpool where the empire still remained, and the teachers were incredibly sadistic. And we learned Latin, Greek, and ancient history, and it was like a Grey Gardens. Mr. McNally came into that school. He was just a breath of fresh air, a free thinker who encouraged us, not to conform, but to be ourselves, to free think, to have passions and dreams, and then to chase those dreams. He used to say, we Liverpool people we look out to sea, we dream, we see a world beyond our shores, and then we go out and chase that. And his own life had been changed by a summer before university that he'd spent in Cape Cod. He'd spent a year there working, and being in America had just informed his whole persona, his whole approach to the world. He actually called it the Cod, which I was on public radio in Boston yesterday, and that's all they wanted to talk about was about the card, which he kept getting wrong constantly. But he'd tell us these stories about being in a bar when it shut down, and in would walk Joni Mitchell, and she'd play a set just for us, the 12 people still in the bar. He had story after story that just made us dream and dream big. And he was a man who treated us 13, 14, 15-year-olds. He knew how to treat us like men, but he also knew when we stepped out of line, when we weren't delivering, when we weren't performing, when we weren't fulfilling our potential, he knew exactly when to treat us like boys. And he passed away about 10 years ago. And I wrote a letter belatedly, and I feel terrible about this. It took me about a year to, find out about it and then write to his widow. And she wrote me a very beautiful letter back where she said, I wrote all the stories that I remembered about him, all of which I've baked into the book. And she said, it's so wonderful to hear from you. His name was Mr. McNally to me, but Chris to her. Said, Chris has been gone a year now, and in many ways it feels like he never was. And hearing you tell me stories makes me feel that he's still here with us. And in a small way, I hope that my book honors his legacy and does bring him back to life. He is the character in the book that most people seem to emotionally relate to. And again, him and my grandfather, those bookends, to bring them back to life and make their memory live again, make their memory be a blessing again is an incredible feeling. Okay, well, we're going to end. Thank you both. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Roger, for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Sheldon and Sheila Lewis, for running the show without me for a while. I will have to say, God willing, I said 2 years ago we'll be back on the roof next year, and we weren't. And but I'm hoping next year we'll be back on the roof in Anshahasset. We won't have people coming in from all other places, but it is a special experience when we're on the roof. So I hope we can get back there next year. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and come back next week. Godspeed. Thank you for having me. Owen, your book sounds amazing. I'm going to go and buy it now. Courage.
Thank you.